Today we try out a business class that I've wanted to try for a long time. Philippine Airlines has been flying to San Francisco for as long as I can remember, mostly with 747s until they were retired, and now with the 777s. Regardless, however, when I wrapped up a recent trip to Asia, I knew exactly what airline I wanted to fly home. Welcome to Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila, where we'll be getting on board Philippine Airlines Mabuhay Business Class for the 13-hour flight to San Francisco. Philippine Airlines has never been known for being the most luxurious business class, but it also isn't the most expensive, with fares from Asia to the United States in business class for as low as about $1,000. So while I don't expect it to be the best luxury travel experience, I am mostly just trying to get a gauge for the value of the money spent. The first thing that I'll mention is that I will never say anything bad about traffic in California ever again after driving in the Philippines. The traffic from my hotel to the airport was only about 4 miles, a little under 7 kilometers, and cost me only about $4, but I was in that taxi for over 45 minutes and we were on a highway for most of that time. Starting off, there is a specific section of Philippine Airlines counters for flights departing to the US. At the moment, that was only Los Angeles, Guam, and San Francisco. These counters do have a few lanes dedicated to business class passengers, but that didn't make the process any easier. First things first, you had to go through a bag check. I had to open my tightly packed suitcase so they could swab the inside of it and make sure there were no hazardous materials. Then after struggling to re-zip it back up, I then proceeded off to the business class counter. One thing I have noticed is that people on these Asia to US flights seem to travel heavy, often with multiple large suitcases and even with large boxes. That didn't help this line move faster, as most people had a large number of bags to check. Even in the business class lines, there was a good amount of people in the queue. Interestingly enough, it would have been faster for me to check in online and proceed to the bag drop counter, which was shared by both business class and economy class passengers. So far, being business class hasn't actually saved me any time. From there, it was off to immigration and security. Interestingly enough, there was no specific immigration and security lane for business class passengers open at the moment. The only priority lane at the airport was for people with disabilities or pregnant women, which is fair, but unique to have no business class specific lane. I also want to mention that whether you're in business or economy class, you'll want to leave an excess of time to get through the airport. Based on the timestamps on the videos I took, it took a total of an hour and a half from the moment I entered the front door of the terminal to the moment when I was through security and onto the terminal. Most Philippine Airlines flights from Manila operate out of Terminal 1, which is Manila's oldest standing international terminal. It's also referred to as the Ninoy Aquino Terminal, as it was the site of his assassination back in 1983. Terminal 1's the busiest of the international terminals here in Manila, but in 2010, more flights began moving to Terminal 3, including a few of Philippine Airlines inter-Asia flights. Renovations to Terminal 1 are ongoing, but the terminal has been over capacity for 30 years now. The opening of other terminals has helped, but Manila's Terminal 1 has ranked amongst Asia's worst terminals for years. This is proved by the amount of people overcrowding, lined up in the hallways, sitting and sleeping on the floor, as well as just the strange layout. You may have seen a bunch of shops as we walked past, but no gates. I found that the large majority of the shops and restaurants were actually quite a ways from the actual gates. There were some other oddities with the terminal layout, as we will see later. There are a few lounges in Terminal 1's US Departures wing. One that is known as the A Lounge and 2 PAGSS lounges. Interestingly enough, all 3 lounges are contract lounges. It does appear that Philippine Airlines has its own Mabuhay Lounge, but is located in Terminal 2. My boarding pass clearly denoted PAGSS Lounge access, so just past Gate 7, I found the PAGSS Lounge. However, when I went to the desk, they informed me that I would have to go to the PAGSS Lounge by Gate 2. This sounded far, but was only about 20 meters away. I found it strange to have 2 of the same lounges so close together. But apparently this is the one that's used for US passengers. But I don't get why they couldn't just have used one lounge for everyone, considering that we hadn't gone through any additional checkpoints or everything from any other passengers. To call this lounge disappointing would be doing it too much of a service. The lounge was nothing more than a small room with limited seating and some food. Even charging ports were hard to come by. I counted about 10 total in the lounge, but they were on 2 power strips in front of 2 specific seats, so you either had to hope one of those seats was available, or whoever was sitting there didn't mind you running your charger around them. However, the most surprising thing was that the lounge didn't even have any restrooms. To use the restroom, you had to go across the hallway to the other PAGSS Lounge. I mean, come on guys, just make it all one lounge. I did eventually go to use the restroom and was surprised to find the other PAGSS Lounge was much larger and nicer. I think I was supposed to leave immediately after using the restroom, but I decided to take the scenic route to exit the lounge so I could see what they had inside. I didn't actually stay in the lounge because I didn't want to push the limits too much, but I was happy I got to see both lounges. Back to our lounge to explore the food options. The food was actually the same in both lounges, with the exception that the larger lounge had a full bar and our lounge just had a few bottles on a shelf for self-service. Other than that though, the food was actually fairly good. There was 2 counters, one for cold items and one for hot items. The cold item counter had a couple dessert options like banana cupcakes, chocolate peanut bars, cookies, nuts, and an avocado ice cream, in addition to cup of noodles, tuna sandwiches, and some bread with jam. Next to that, in the corner, was the drinks. First was the fridge with the soft drink options, including sodas, juices, and some fresh cut fruit. Next to that was the San Miguel beer on tap, and lastly was the coffee machine. The counter next to the drinks was home to the hot food options, which was, in my opinion, the best food in the lounge, with options like chicken adobo, penne pasta, mascloon, chicken arroz caldo, and dim sum. Then, at the far end of the buffet, was all the plates, which took me admittedly longer than it probably should have to find. After about 30 minutes, I was able to get a seat by the charging strip since I wanted my devices fully charged for the flight, although as I sat later waiting for my flight and beginning the script for this video, my laptop just once again died, but at least I had a window seat. Leaving the lounge about 10 minutes before boarding left me time for one more security check, which is somewhat normal for most US-bound flights to go through an extra security screening, but it did require me to take my shoes off and my laptop out just one more time. I found the layout of the terminal to be just a bit strange, especially for US-bound passengers, as I had already passed the majority of shops and restaurants, and more importantly all of the lounges. But now that I had gone through the security screening for the US passengers, I was stuck on this side of the checkpoint where there was one little restaurant, a little souvenir shop, and a restroom. But honestly, that was about it that we had here while we waited to board. As you can see, the gate areas were packed. It didn't help that every flight was delayed, which I did find a bit strange considering it wasn't all that bad of a weather day here in Manila. Los Angeles' flight left about an hour and a half late, the Guam flight was having maintenance issues and had been sitting for a while, and our gate was filling up as boarding time was now about 5 minutes ago. Another thing that I found odd and nerve-wracking was that there wasn't even an airplane at our gate yet. An airplane did finally pull up, although at the gate adjacent to ours. Eventually our departure time came and went, still with no airplane, but more upsetting was not even a single announcement from the gate agents except for calling up random people to the gate for different checks. Finally, 30 minutes after our scheduled departure, the gate agent came on the speaker to let us all know that our aircraft had arrived. Our plane today, a 777, had lived its 14-year life all with Philippine Airlines. Finally, boarding began, but we were having trouble because half the passengers had their boarding pass in the Apple Wallet, but the gate agents needed the actual physical boarding pass so that they could tear off the part for them to keep passenger count. It also didn't help that the flight was 100% fully sold out, so there was the maximum amount of people lined up trying to find their boarding pass or worse, have a new one printed. Philippine Airlines Business Class is definitely in an outdated style, with a 2-3-2 setup with lie-flat seats. Like most 777s, there's 2 business class cabins, the first one in the very front being 4 rows deep, and the aft one where I'm sitting being 2 rows deep. The seat itself is a cloth material in different shades of blue. I feel like the color palette makes it look a bit older than it is, unless these are actually the same seats from 2009, which I guess is a very real possibility. They also came stocked with the in-flight amenities. Each seat is actually fairly large with a good amount of legroom, more than I could ever need. Now to take a look at the aspects of the seat. The armrest is adjustable, but I didn't figure out how to move it until later in the flight. By lifting this tab, you can either raise it or lower it, but it must be all the way up or all the way down. The footrest folds out and gives you a nice place to prop up your feet when you're sleeping or resting as well. I also noticed when getting off the plane that there may have been a cup holder here in a past life. On the center console, you'll find the charging ports on the front with universal charging ports and USB ports. This had a closable panel that we never really used. On the inside of the center console, you'll find the remote for the in-flight entertainment screen, which is super helpful considering just how far the entertainment screen is from your seat. The seat controls are a bit strange, as you'll find all the presets on the center console by the counter that's for drinks. There's also individual seat controls for each part of the seat, but they're inside the flap that's also home to the tray table. That tray table pulls out as one big table in a fairly good size. It's just a bit awkward to get in and out since it can't really move without having to raise the flap on the center console. So in flight I commonly had to move everything I had sitting there in order to move the tray table out of my way if I had to get up. Then behind the center console we also have these little reading lights. Unfortunately, there was no overhead air vents, although fortunately the cabin was kept cooler than most cabins I've recently been in, so I was perfectly fine with shorts and the blanket we were given. The TVs are located right in front of each passenger, but if you're in a business class seat, you'll find them to be fairly far away, although they are still touchscreen in addition to remote controlled. Next to the TV is also the literature pocket cubby with some items in that. We were also handed out face masks and menus that were sitting on our center console when we arrived at the seat. Speaking of the menu, the food is where Philippine Airlines really shines in my opinion. First off is the food options, where you can see the dinner options, then the mid-flight snacks, and lastly was a breakfast service, which means they're timing the meals based off the time in Manila, since we arrived in San Francisco at about 9 p.m., which is a strange time to eat breakfast, although it would be about noon to 1 p.m. in Manila. Then was the beverages. There was a full page of wines, mostly from California. This was followed by a few beers and hard alcohols, along with the cocktails that they can make with those alcohols, and below was all the non-alcoholic options, including coffees, teas, sodas, and juices. Other freebies with the seat included slippers and an amenity kit, which are only given on overnight flights for business class passengers. Then the amenity kit, which I couldn't figure out if the brand was Eric's or Brick's since the letters all kind of blended together. Regardless though, the bag was actually a pretty nice material. Inside the bag was the usual set of things, socks and dental kit, but oddly enough no eye mask or earplugs. In addition to that was the amenities including lip balm, face and body lotions, and a facial mist from Payo. The pillow supplied with the seats was fairly substantial. It was a semi-firm pillow, had a good amount of thickness to it, making it great for sleep and relaxation all on its own without needing help from another pillow. The blanket was also wonderful. It may not have been the thickest blanket, but it did have a fleece lining, which was great not only for warming you up, but it was also extremely comfortable. I was also excited because I read online that Philippine Airlines offered free and fast in-flight Wi-Fi, as now evidenced by the placards on the bulkhead. A weird detail that was bugging me was that there seemed to be some delamination of the walls of the cabin above one of my 4 windows. It almost seemed like it was filled with water or something. My guess is that it just came unstuck from the aircraft walls since it's just a decal for decor. If there was actually water in there, I would assume that it's just from the air conditioner and the condenser for dealing with the humidity. The lavatory was fairly basic, but I did appreciate the blue countertop at the very least to give it their own little touch. There was also a few amenities like the soap of course, but also cologne, lotion, and mouthwash with cups above that. Before pushback, we were given hot towels and a beverage of choice, of which I chose to get some champagne. In the meantime though, it is slipper time. Also, literally since editing this video, United has announced that they will begin non-stop flights to Manila from San Francisco, giving Philippine Airlines a bit of competition on the US routes, as no other US airline currently flies to the Philippines except for United's short-haul routes from Guam. As we taxi out, one thing I will mention is that the crew was fantastic. For starters, on boarding they asked how I'd like to be addressed, which was a great personal touch. In addition, one of the best things about the Philippines in general is that in the cities at least, people generally speak great English. This was true for the crews on Philippine Airlines flights as well. This is not always a given on Asian carriers, even though obviously English is an ICAO standard and all crew must be English proficient, but unfortunately there's still often some form of language barrier on a lot of Asian airlines, whether it's that they aren't familiar with certain phrases or the different accents make it harder to understand. Not to any fault of those airlines, as they don't have a ton of control over that, and any type of English is appreciated, but on Philippine Airlines flights I found the conversation to be completely fluent English, including common slang terms, and so for travelers that are less comfortable with English language barriers, that may be a reason to fly Philippine Airlines on flights to Asia, as you can connect to Manila to get just about anywhere. I also realized as we taxied out that there's not only a large maintenance base in Manila, but specifically one that services a lot of A380s, as there was Korean Air and Emirates A380s that I could see in those hangars. Once in the air, I started to notice that there were some things broken on my seat. Before departure, actually, the purser came to tell me and my seatmate that our screens and reclining features were broken. Obviously, that would totally suck after paying for business class. However, we tested it and everything was working just fine. Once we got in the air, however, we began to notice some issues. As it turned out, the power to the entire center console, which controlled both of our seats, was intermittent. At times, things would work fine, but not at other times. For about an hour or two, we would lose control over anything connected to the console, and then you'd get about 10 to 15 minutes where they would work normally. You can see first that the remote wasn't working. The only button that did work was the control for the flight attendant calling and the overhead light, sometimes. So at one point, the overhead light was stuck on while the whole cabin was dark, and I tried to cover it with my hand the best I could. I also accidentally hit the flight attendant call button and then couldn't turn it back off, so both the light and the flight attendant call button were stuck on for about 15 minutes until I could get the buttons to work again. The reading light mounted to the center console was also more of a strobe light than a steady reading light, rendering it almost unusable. Lastly, and perhaps the most upsetting, was that the seat controls rarely worked. As you see here, they were constantly flashing. When they were flashing, they weren't working. But when the lights were solid, which only lasted for a short while, I could control the seat, which proved harmful at bedtime, but we'll get to that later. For now, however, a look through the in-flight entertainment, which did work. Unfortunately, since the remote didn't work, I had to use the touchscreen, which is usually okay, but it was just so far from my seat that I usually had to get out of my seat and crouch or kneel on the floor to make my selection and then sit back down, which was tough with the tray table because there wasn't enough space for a human to squeeze around the tray table. So if my tray table was out and I had to use the screen, I had to carefully find a place to put everything that was on the table so I could move it out of my way, which was just a bit of a process. First off was the movies. There wasn't exactly an endless selection like the kind you'd find on North American or Gulf carriers, but there was still plenty to choose from. They had it sorted by genre, but also had English and Pinoy selections. Once choosing the genre, you'll be presented with a number of selections and multiple pages of selections at that. The calibration of the touch did seem to be slightly off, as it often took significant pressure to get it to register, and sometimes it would register that I had pressed somewhere slightly different. They did have multiple episodes of the shows that they did have, but the shows that they had were just kind of strange, things that I wouldn't typically watch on a flight or at home. Each show had about 2 to 3 episodes in sequence, but from a random season. I usually wish that if airlines only had a few random episodes, that it would at least be the first few episodes, so you could almost use it as a trial for that show. I personally was kind of hoping they'd have Superstore as well, one of my favorite shows, but also one of the top TV comedies in the Philippines. The music did actually have a good selection, and I did consider just listening to something at a couple points of the flight. They had English and Pinoy radio, but they also had a large number of albums for different genres, so there was plenty to choose from. Then came the game... Never mind. Lastly was the flight map option, which gave me a headache from the flashing, so I opted to only use it when I absolutely wanted to check on our progress a couple of times throughout the flight. There isn't any in-flight magazine on Philippine Airlines flights, instead opting to use the display screen on the seatback TV to show all the information. We were able to learn about the Philippine Airlines culture and a good amount of their destinations. It's included things like their walkthroughs of a number of their aircraft, information of their internet and baggage policies, tour packages for a number of their top destinations, instructions on the USB player, which got me stuck in a loop of terms and conditions, and lastly was a shopping catalog, which makes me really just miss Sky Mall catalogs. I was also excited to try out the in-flight Wi-Fi they boasted about and just see how fast it was. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it to show up. Throughout the flight, the purser reset it a few times, but we were never able to get it working. Shortly after departure, they came through the cabin to take our orders for dinner. By the time they got to me, they had already ran out of a couple of items, but fortunately, there was still the best one left, the pork adobo. I didn't hesitate for a second to order that, as well as a cup of tea to go with it. To start the meal service, we got the amuse-bouche of salmon mousse on a cucumber and a melon ball with prosciutto and mozzarella, along with the tiger beer that I like to get whenever I'm in Asia. They then came around with the tray of bread for our choice. I opted to go with one of the Filipino sweet rolls, however they also insisted I try the garlic bread as well. I also opted for a tiger beer, which is a favorite of mine whenever I'm in Asia. Then for our appetizer, I chose the tuna tataki salad instead of the beef and bone marrow with corn. It sounded lighter, healthier, and in my opinion, better. You also know that I'm a big fan of the custom branded silverware, and while it isn't the most obvious branding, there was a Philippine Airlines logo carved into the fork and spoon and printed on the knives. Then came the main course, and I was hyped. Pork adobo, one of my favorite Philippine dishes, and it was cooked to perfection. The pork was wonderfully seasoned and the texture was wonderful. The rice was actually a garlic fried rice flavored with the adobo reduction sauce and topped with a few chilies as well. I then asked for a good nighttime tea and was given this matcha green tea. I would have probably preferred more of a chamomile tea, which they offered me later in the flight, but this would do for now. I was luckily tired enough that a little matcha green tea was not going to win the sleep battle. Then to wrap up the meal, they came by with a tray of desserts including chocolate cake, chocolate chip cookie, vanilla ice cream, and a cheesecake with raspberry sauce. I opted to end my meal with the cheesecake. Once the meal wrapped up and people prepared for sleep, they also passed out a single water bottle to every passenger. Just after takeoff, when my seat controls were working for a bit, I decided to check out the bed, since I wasn't sure how long or if it would work later. The seats in Philippine Airlines Business Class do not go entirely 180 degrees flat, but they do lie flat, just at an angle, hence the name angled lie flat. One thing you'll notice is that even with it fully deployed, there's still room between the end of the seat and the seat back of the row in front of you. The bed itself was actually fairly firm, not the hardest surface ever, but definitely firm. The pillow and blanket being wonderful did help to make the bed fairly comfortable, and because the cabin was kept a bit cooler, it made for a great place to sleep. Now here is the issue. Those bed shots were filmed just after takeoff before the meal. Once it was actually bedtime, you can see the buttons were flashing once again. I was definitely ready for bed, but it appeared that the seat was not, as I was unable to recline it, making it more upright than I would have been even in economy class with the standard recline. I decided to watch more of my movie and hope the controls would come online again soon, and after about 30 to 45 minutes, the lights turned solid once again and I could recline, although still not all the way, as on my way down they went out of service again. I was able to get it into a relaxed position, but definitely not flat or close to it, but it was good enough to get some sleep. So with that, I will see you guys when I wake up. A few hours later, I woke up to the beginning signs of a sunrise. Having taken off just after midnight, it wasn't long before we saw that sunrise. I was still in and out of sleep, but had to pay attention to the sun coming up over the horizon. Interestingly enough, since we landed at about 10 p.m., it meant that we would see the sunset as well, which is a weird schedule when you get to speed run your way through a full sun cycle. I would say a day, but technically we cross the date line and go back a day. After a few more hours of sleep, once I was fully awake, I went to the bathroom to freshen up and use the mouthwash and cups provided to passengers. And for those who get a bit snacky, there was also a snack basket in the galley with both fruit and savory snacks. The weird thing about these flights is that even though most of the cabin was in daytime and we were arriving at bedtime, they still kept the cabin completely dark. I would think for the sake of jet lag, you'd want to keep at least some light in the cabin until at least sunset. Back at my seat, it is dark, but my seat neighbor was still in her sleep, which brought me to realize that the best thing about these seats is how easy it is to get past your seat neighbor when they are fully flat, since there's room between the bed and the seat back in front. It's a bit of a shame that it doesn't join a footrest, as I feel that would help it fully lie flat and might be more comfortable, but in a 2-3-2 configuration, I may appreciate this style a little bit more. We were still about 6 hours from San Francisco, so I decided to order something from the mid-flight snack menu. In this case, I went with the pancit canton bihon guisado, or essentially stir-fried noodles with shrimp. I also asked for a cup of coffee, so you could understand my confusion when they gave me water, but still with creamer and sugar. Turns out they were still making the coffee, so a few minutes later, life made sense again. Now that it was light out, I realized why the camera had been having trouble focusing earlier. You'll see these marks all over each window, which I'm assuming means they just need a bit of a cleaning. A couple hours from landing, they took our breakfast orders. You'll see in a moment that the food was amazing, but it was a strange timing since we were landing at about 10 p.m. in San Francisco, and even in Manila time, it's only 1 p.m., so I wouldn't have expected a breakfast, maybe more of a lunch meal instead. Not complaining because, like I mentioned, it was still fantastic. The breakfast service was started with a hot towel and a wonderful mango smoothie. Then came a yogurt parfait along with a fresh fruit plate as well. Once again, they came around with a bread basket with pan de sol bread, cheese bread, and a croissant. And then came, finally, the breakfast itself, for which I ordered the chicken sisig burrito, which was not quite as good as my other meals, but still great and definitely above average for an airplane meal. By then, we had started our descent into San Francisco, but since I was still mid-movie, I was glad that my seatmate chose to have her map up, although hers too kept flickering and was giving me the same headache after a while, although at least I was able to keep track of our location. Speaking of things needing a bath, I noticed the discoloration in the cowling inlet on the engine, and I'm not sure if it's just dirty or starting to show signs of wear, but it was the first time in the flight I had a chance to actually look at the engine since the sun was finally setting, and the cabin lights were brought up slightly for the meal, so I didn't feel as bad about opening my window shades and illuminating part of the cabin. It also felt a little strange seeing the sunset since, in a 12-hour flight, we took off about midnight, watched the sunrise, flew through an entire day period, watched the sun set again, and landed just before midnight on the same day that we departed due to the international dateline. I don't know, time's just weird or something. Also, as a pro tip for those of you flying into San Francisco, if you're coming from the north, you'll want a seat on the left side of the aircraft, in the A seats, to give you a great view of San Francisco itself as you fly by. As we make our final descent into San Francisco, I was thinking about how, since the window shades were asked to be kept down and the lights were mostly kept off, even on a mostly daytime flight, I would like to pose a question to you all. If you're on a long-haul flight, whether it be daytime or not, does it bug you when the cabin is kept dark the whole time? Maybe it's just me personally, but if it's daytime, I would like at least some level of light, even if it's artificial lights from cabin lights. I totally get dimming the cabins to help with jet lag, but as I type this script, it's currently 4 a.m. in San Francisco after I landed, and I'm barely tired since the cabin was kept dark, keeping me sleepy for so long. I never really felt like I got to start my day until I landed, at which point everyone else around me was getting ready to go to sleep. On a lesser note, being in a dark tube for that long also tends to give me a bit more sense of discomfort. I'm not sure I'd classify it as claustrophobia, but I definitely feel a bit cooped up. So definitely let me know your thoughts on that below. When it comes to my final thoughts on Philippine Airlines, I have to consider a couple of things. First off, I was fortunate to get a non-stop flight from Asia to San Francisco for $1,100. For comparison, the other non-stop flights commonly here are more expensive. For example, Cathay Pacific, Hong Kong to SFO is around $5,000, Singapore is around $4,000, EVA Air is around $6,000, and the list goes on. That being said, I don't think that Philippine Airlines' product is remotely close to the service offered by those airlines either. Because of that, I want to consider the value more than the apples-to-apples comparison. Starting with the airport experience, the business class offerings at Manila are currently worse than most economy class offerings in other places in the world. The idea that economy passengers could get through faster than us if they checked in online was odd. I would usually expect that business class specific lines would help get through security faster. That being said, Manila Airport is the true example of hurry up and wait, since even if I was able to check in faster, I still would have had to join the same immigration and security lane as economy class passengers as well. I'll include that I do travel economy often, so I'm used to those lines in some places, but when I do pay a little extra for business class, getting a shorter waiting time is typically one of the top perks. Once through security, Terminal 1 is madness and needs to be replaced or expanded. The only extra amenity for business class passengers was a lounge, if you can even call it that. I was happy to have free food, but still struggled to find charging ports. What I will say is that the product on board definitely is starting to show its age, but as far as a 232 setup goes, it really isn't terrible. The best benefit was still having room to get around the passenger in the aisle. Typically, like on Lufthansa, if the aisle passenger is in bed mode, it's impossible to get past them. The food was top-notch, and I couldn't have asked for much more from the crew either. As they were wonderful, the entire flight spoke English to me and everything. So the question we always visit is, would I fly it again? And honestly, the answer is yes and no, but I'll specify why I say that. First off, the value for the money, I believe, is more than sufficient. Sure, it isn't the most grand business class in the world, but it's also one of the cheapest. However, on a few occasions when traveling in Asia, Philippine Airlines has been the cheapest business class to get to San Francisco, from places like Taipei, Shanghai, Tokyo, etc. But Asiana is usually only a couple $100 more, if not even. And while I haven't published a video yet on Asiana's business class, especially on the A350s, it's a much better experience in a 1-2-1 setup with a proper lounge, a proper business class airport entrance, and amenities. Not to mention, Philippine Airlines tickets are near impossible to book with points since they aren't in any alliance and only have a few random airline partners. So essentially, if Philippine Airlines was the cheapest option, I could definitely see myself flying with them again, but otherwise it might be worth spending a bit more and taking a different airline. That being said, with a 1-2-1 business class, their A350 cabins seem to be a bit more of a game changer and potentially signs of better things to come for Philippine Airlines, so we'll add that to our to-do list. But for now, let me know your thoughts on Philippine Airlines' business class, and as always, safe travels, and I'll see y'all next time.